It's our pleasure now to welcome to the Mohegan Sun World Baseball Coaches Convention the manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates, Derek Shelton. Derek, how you doing?
Hey, Danny, what's going on? How are you?
I'm doing all right. Hope you and your family are keeping well. Are you counting the days until spring training 2021?
Yeah, I'm ready. I mean, with the Pirates, we have a lot of work to do, but exciting, and the off season's been interesting so far. So as long as we stay healthy and are able to get to Bradenton on time, I'll be ready.
Good. I want to talk to you about this young team that you've got that's hoping to rise back up into a contender. But I want to take you into the Wayback Machine a little bit. Back in your playing days, did you see yourself as a future coach or manager, or were you just 100% locked in on being the best player that you could be?
Well, number one, I was a bad player, so I think the funny thing is when I signed with the Yankees, the day that I signed, my scout said, we think you're going to be a really good coach someday, which is interesting. That's not what you want to hear the day you sign. But I think all along I knew I wanted to go into coaching. I knew I wanted to manage in the minor leagues, and when you have the skill set that I have and you're not a very good player, you hope at some point you can get to the big leagues to coach. And I just wanted to make a life in professional baseball and coaching.
How old were you when you retired as a player?
Retired was is probably a really nice way to put it. I had an injury that people say ended my career, but lack of talent ended my career. I was 23 when I had surgery, and was able to get back in the game fairly quickly, just because of some the injury and some other circumstances.
So, what was your first coaching job in the minor leagues, I presume, and how did you find that job, or how did it find you?
Well, my first coaching job is I was a hitting coach in the Gulf Coast League in 1997, and Mark Newman, who ran the Yankees for a long time and recently passed, gave me my first opportunity. Him and Gary Denbo, who now works for the Marlins, they gave me my first opportunity to be a hitting coach in the Gulf Coast League, and it kind of went for there. So I was really fortunate that during my playing days, my short playing days, and with the Yankees, that these guys took a liking to me and gave me an opportunity.
How old were you in 1997?
I was 26 when I got my first job. So yeah, it's crazy. 26 when I got my first coaching job.
So what was, I mean, and the players in the Gulf Coast League, I guess you would have had, teenagers, 18, 19-year-olds, that sort of thing. Was it, I mean, you were older than them, but not that much older than them. Did it feel kind of strange coaching people only 7, 8 years younger than you?
Yeah, it was strange. We had a group. I mean, at that time, Jackson Million was Marcus Timms, who's now the Yankees hitting coach. That was that group, and felt really fortunate to have a job. But I was extremely young, had a lot to learn, was really green. I was fortunate. I live in Tampa. I live in St. Pete Beach now, but lived in Tampa at the time and was there year round. So I was able to be around a lot of those guys that were part of the core of those good Yankee teams, and basically stood as a fly on the wall and learned. I probably learned more in the off seasons when Jeter would come in to hit and Georgie would come in to hit and Tino Martinez would come in to hit. And David Cohn was there and basically didn't do anything, just sat there and watched and listened and learned, and feel very fortunate about those times.
Did you have other types of coaching jobs in the minors? Were you a catching coach ever, a third base coach? I guess you're kind of a jack of all trades, depending on the level you're at, too.
Yeah, in the minor leagues, you do everything. I coached third. I was a catching coach. The one thing I was really fortunate that Mark Newman did for me is he never let me do anything where like my strength was, or where I perceive my strength was. And what I mean by that is, having been a catching coach in our catcher in the minor leagues, it was one of those things that every spring training I came in and I went with the infielders, and I spent time with Trey Holman or Cleet Boyer or Greg Nettles. And then I went with the outfielders and was around veteran guys. I didn't know how to do those things, but one of the things Mark always said was, if you're going to manage, you're going to have to learn the full scope of the game. And looking back at it at the time, I was really uncomfortable and I didn't know what I was doing. But now I realized it was probably the best thing for me.
Did you try to learn about coaching in any other ways? I mean, you said you were kind of a sponge and you're picking up things along the way. But did you read books about coaching? Did you go to seminars or conventions about coaching? Were there other things that you tried to do on your way up the ladder?
Yeah, I did. I've spoken a lot of these. I've spoken at the Mohegan Sun in person, which I know this year we're not doing. I've spoken some other places, and when I was there at those conventions, I went in and listened to other people of how they of how they teach, how they coach, what their process is. And then I read a lot of books. And again, Mark was pretty influential in that. He would give me different books on leadership and different books on coaching. You know, the best book I think I ever read on coaching was Pat Summitt's book. You know, she was, you know, probably the greatest women's coach of all time. I know in Connecticut that might not go over very well with Gino there, but her book really resonated with how she dealt with young athletes and in the time frame in which she coached and their message. And it's something that really resonated.
What was her message? If you could boil it down to a couple of sentences, what did you take from the book?
I think her one message that really stood out was start your message with athletes and end with the same message, because sometimes you get, you know, the attention span in between that goes away. So make sure your message is short, but make sure what you start with is what you end with. And that will resonate most with, especially the young athletes.
How much do you try to balance? You want to be positive, you want to boost their confidence, but sometimes you got to give a guy a kick in the rear end, figuratively speaking, to get him to do what you know he's capable of doing. How do you balance those two things?
Well, I think the biggest balance there is communication and transparency. And it's one of the things that we're really trying to do in Pittsburgh right now is if you over communicate on the front end, sometimes, you know, athletes don't want to hear, players don't want to hear what you have to say, but on the back end, if that conversation gets tough, you're able to reference back like, hey, this is what we were talking about. This is why it's going to be difficult. And this is how we have to work through it.
I know it's 1,000 times different from what you did. You're at the major league level, but I coached a pretty good travel ball team of 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And you didn't want to favor anybody. You wanted to treat everybody the same, as much as your messaging had to be a little bit different. When you're dealing with professional athletes, do you worry about the optics of, hey, it looks like I'm being easier on this guy than on that guy, or is that not in your mind at all?
No, I think it's in your mind, and it's not easier or harder depending on what their status is. It's more how people take things, and every athlete is different, every player is different, and I think good coaches are able to mold their message to individual players. I mean, our relationship goes back to a year that I spent in Toronto in 2017, and I think John Gibbons is probably the best I've ever seen at it. The how he related his message to, that group had a bunch of superstar players, and he was the master of, he had to be harder on some guys, he had to be softer on some guys, and it really didn't depend on who they were as in terms of status in the game, but it depend on, who they were in terms of how they could be coached. And I feel very fortunate in that year to watch how he handled, JD, and how he handled Batista and Russ and that group. And I think that really stands out of, it's really not who the player is, but how they can be coached.
You go back before your time in Toronto, you go back to Tampa Bay, and there are managers all around baseball now who can trace their roots back to the Rays organization. Charlie Montoyo, Kevin Cash, who's obviously still there, Rocco Baldelli. What was it like being with that group as you guys sat down or had a post-game beer, talked about the game, talked about the next day's game? It must have been a really great group to be a part of as you were all progressing in your careers.
Yeah, it was a really fun group. I mean, Charlie has extensive time in the minor leagues, and he's managed more games than all of us in that group combined. So it was really interesting to hear his thought process. And Rock had come through, kind of a different path with the fact that he spent time in scouting, and Rocco and I were able to spend not only those years together, but 2 years together in Minnesota. And he looks at the game through a different lens. And then Kevin had just started managing and was a sponge and was learning everything, about how he could do it and why he could do it. And the fact that we would sit around and kind of bang ideas off each other was really fun. That's still a group that I'm extremely tight with now. And look back on, I mean, I'm the youngest manager of that group, and am able to ask those guys questions of what they've done and how they've done it. But a lot of different lenses, but all for the same path. And that's why, I really treasure those times with those guys.
I understand there's a pretty entertaining, some good group text chats between the group that are flying back and forth all the time.
Yeah, well, with Rock and Charlie, it's easy to get them. I mean, Kevin doesn't respond to any text messages from anybody, but it is fun. It's a very colorful group. It's a very exciting group, and there's a lot of funny banter back and forth.
I'm sure. You need talent to win. That's obvious. But how do you balance, hey, this guy's got a little bit more talent, but the intangibles on this guy are off the charts. He might be a little bit more coachable. How do you balance those two?
Well, I think you have to balance it. Talent will rise to the top, in all situations. The one thing when you're building a culture, you're building an environment, you have to combine both. And I think that goes back to the communication aspect that we were talking about earlier, and just making sure you do communicate. But with guys that do have those intangibles, you can get different things out of them, and it's extremely important when you're building a culture to maximize all those things.
So what does culture mean to you as you try to instill that with the Pittsburgh Pirates? What does that word mean to you?
Culture means the fact that we're going to let the players have a say. We use the term player-centric, and making sure that the players have a voice in what their development is. And I think what we're finding with young players these days, and players that come through very elite programs, is they know what they're doing. They know how they're doing it, and they know how they want to be coached. And one of the important things for our group is to make sure that we provide them the voice, and then provide them with the not only opportunity to say how they want to do things and what they want to do, but also to give them feedback on how we feel they can be better. And then the most important thing, and I think it resonates back to Tampa with Joe, is have fun. This game's hard. There's a lot of failure in it. And we have to be very careful, not always talking about the negative, and we have to create a fun environment for every day.
Are you a big rules guy, or you kind of let the clubhouse govern itself within reason?
No, I don't have very many rules at all. I don't think I've ever worked for a guy that had a lot of rules. It's more, the players are going to govern themselves. And I think it's more guidelines. If you give them, parameters, you give players a parameters of what you expect, and then they start to get close, then you can have discussions on it. But, John Wooden was the master of having no rules and having players govern themselves. And, he did it in a time where, the world was changing, just like the world is changing for us right now. So as long as we can give them parameters, we find that players will stay within them. And then you just have to discuss if they get close, okay, hey, we can't do this, and this is the reason why. But players will flourish if they have the ability to be themselves.
For high school coaches, college coaches, minor league coaches and managers who are just getting into it now, who are at the stage where you were maybe, 15, 20 years ago, what kind of advice would you give them right now?
Be positive with your players. The game's based on negative, and, the old saying is, if you are successful 3 out of 10 times in baseball, they get you a plaque in Cooperstown. The game is hard. And I think a lot of times, especially with younger coaches and younger parents, we want to dwell on the negative. And I say that to myself. I mean, I have a 20-year-old son that's the college baseball player, and we have to make sure that we dwell on the positives, because this game is really hard. And if we accentuate the negatives, it becomes even harder. So just make sure we focus on the positives and simplify it. The game is based on a lot of advanced analytics at the upper levels now, and it's extremely important to use. But we have to focus on seeing the baseball and catching the baseball and hitting the baseball, and we can let a lot of those other things play out as we get to the higher levels.
Well, it may be the off season, but your beard is in mid-season form right now. This could be July 2021, as far as I'm concerned. So you've obviously put a lot of work into it over the off season.
Yeah, it just continues to get grayer. I mean, when you're a hitting coach, it gets gray, but when you start to manage, it can get gray really fast.
Always great to catch up with you, Shelty. Have a great season next year. Thanks for doing this.
All right. Thanks, Dan.